Good morning. My name is Merci Lawluvi, and I am the Executive Director at Immigrant Women Services Ottawa, popularly known as IWSO here in Canada. IWSO is an organization which has been providing services to immigrant and racialized women who are newcomers and or victims of violence for the past 35 years. In this short virtual presentation, I will share with you how IWSO crisis counselors, who themselves are immigrant and racialized women, work with migrant victims or survivors of violence here in Ottawa. Crisis counselors have the training and expertise to provide crisis intervention, short-term counseling, safety planning, advocacy, referrals, and long-term therapeutic counseling when assisting migrant victims of violence to help them ensure their safety and that of their children, access support services, cope with trauma, and seek justice. IWSO crisis counselors may not come from the same culture or country as the victims, so we use trained interpreters to assist in bridging the language gap. IWSO has a very robust interpretation service with over 200 professionally trained interpreters who speak over 70 languages and dialects. In addition to formal interpretation training, the interpreters also receive specialized training on terminology for domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, elder abuse, and anti-oppression. And they receive further monthly professional development trainings. This is important. What is important to note is that interpreters are required to only interpret exactly what is said by the crisis counselors or service providers and the victims. At IWSO, there is a very clear distinction between the roles of crisis counselors and interpreters when assisting migrant victims of violence. For example, when a victim is referred to a service provider, such as a lawyer, an interpreter is assigned to attend the session to provide interpretation only. We consider the victims to be the experts in their situation, and by providing interpretation support, we give them a voice to articulate in their own words their situation, their goals, and aspirations. And we find this to be very effective in empowering the victims to take control of their lives. We are very careful to use only trained interpreters, as those who are untrained can add, omit, or alter important information and may not observe confidentiality. Having made this important distinction, my focus will now be on the identification and communication with migrant women who are victims or survivors of violence, the challenges and the best practices for working with this vulnerable and diverse group, and self-care for counselors in order to avoid the negative consequences of this work, such as vicarious trauma and burnout. Immigration is a significant life event for migrant women who, upon arrival in a new country, need supports and resources to help them overcome challenges and better adapt to their new environment. These challenges are often compounded by the experience of violence. Refugees who have fled for their safety due to war or conflict, for example, are particularly vulnerable as they experience extreme angst from the trauma of their displacement. One of the challenges of working with female migrants is to identify victims of violence and communicate with them appropriately in order to provide the needed supports. Many migrant women experiencing violence are sometimes unwilling to disclose their experience of violence, and this may be due to shame and/or fear. Sometimes they are reluctant to disclose violence because they lack official documentation to substantiate allegations of abuse, especially in the case of sexual assault or rape. Lack of knowledge of how the system works in the new country also causes fear, and the provision of information and options removes that fear and brings strength and courage. In order to identify the experience of violence, our crisis counselors look for A. The indicators or warning signs of violence. These are clues that something is happening in the life of the migrant woman that should be looked into. Some indicators are obvious signs of abuse. These are visible signs such as black eyes or bruises. Other indicators are more subtle and non-visible, such as fear, anxiety, withdrawal, amongst others. Secondly, it is equally important to consider the convergence or intersections of multidimensional and complex identities of migrant women. For instance, considering their race, age, sexual orientation, education, religion, socioeconomic status, and etc., and the systems and structures in society that create inequalities and oppression, such as racism, discrimination, heterosexism, ableism, etc. Understanding intersectionality is essential to understanding the realities and prejudices that migrant women face in their daily lives. This provides the opportunity for the counselors to take a holistic approach when working with female migrants who are victims of violence. Once violence is identified, our crisis counselors conduct a risk assessment to determine the level of risk posed to each migrant woman and respond accordingly. Safety planning is conducted with each and every victim based on their unique circumstances. Because migrant women are victims of violence, have such complex needs and challenges, our crisis counselors use a trauma-informed approach when communicating with them. A trauma-informed approach is based on the principles of respect, dignity, inclusiveness, and empowerment, with the aim to minimize harm to victims and support their healing process. A trauma-informed approach uses 4 key principles. 1. Understanding trauma and violence and their impact on the victims' lives. 2. Creating emotionally and physically safe environments for the victims or survivors. 3. Fostering opportunities for choice. And 4. Providing a strength-based approach by acknowledging the tremendous resilience of the migrant women and their capacity to retake control of their lives. Our IWSO crisis counselors often encounter various challenging situations in their practice. Some of these challenges include initial lack of trust by the victims, or fear that the information they disclose will not be treated with confidentiality, and also the experience of power imbalance, where the victim perceives that the counselor is the expert, has more control, influence, and resources. And this may either lead to dependence on the counselor for every action, or may cause the victim to feel intimidated, disempowered, or mistrustful of the counselor. It is to note that for migrant victims of violence, the issue of power imbalance is very real and affects their well-being, safety, and recovery. Power imbalance may cause victims to experience secondary victimization or re-traumatization, as they may feel they are being judged, stereotyped, or ignored. In order to prevent the experience of power imbalance and its consequences, our counselors use a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, and empowerment-based approach that respects the autonomy, dignity, and diversity of the victims. Again, we recognize that the victim is the expert in her own situation, and the crisis counselors listen, empathize, validate, and provide options to the victims, thereby giving them back the power they had lost due to their experience of violence or abuse. Our crisis counselors and professional interpreters understand that by working with migrant victims of violence, they will be exposed to very difficult and disturbing stories and/or images which may cause vicarious trauma, the negative consequences of which are sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue or burnout. To prevent vicarious trauma leading to burnout and maintaining their well-being, our crisis counselors and interpreters regularly receive professional development training to mitigate its impact on them. They receive information on how to recognize the physical, behavioral, and emotional symptoms and how to develop self-care strategies accordingly. These include, in broad terms, self-awareness, boundaries, work-life balance, connection, working proactively, and rethinking or reframing how the work is done. Some specific examples include setting boundaries and limits with clients and colleagues, seeking support and supervision, engaging in regular reflection and feedback, taking care of their physical and mental health, pursuing hobbies and interests outside of work, and cultivating a positive attitude and a sense of humor. As an additional measure in maintaining the well-being of our crisis counselors at IWSO, and in view of the extremely disturbing stories that they hear from victims on a daily basis, we have included the Employee Assistance Program as a benefit for counselors, where they can seek independent counseling support for themselves if they recognize that they are experiencing vicarious trauma or are unable to maintain a good work-life balance, for example. As I mentioned earlier, this is an extremely brief presentation on some of the work that IWSO does with migrant women who are victims of violence here in Ottawa, Canada. I take this opportunity to thank you for reaching out to IWSO, and I hope that this information will be helpful in your deliberations. Thank you.